Luck is a luck.
Hey guys, it's Midnight Philoppicer and welcome to my guide on how to pick an ASSA 700. I've broken up this guide into 8 sections, which I've used the YouTube timestamp feature in order to break up this bar in the bottom here, so that way you can scroll through the video at any point and know what part of the video you're on for future reference, or if you just want to skip ahead. The first section is obviously what we're in right now, the table of contents. Then we'll go over some of the background of the lock, some of the history and where it comes from, as well as how it fits into the lock sport community. Number 3 is inside the lock. We'll take a close look at all of the components. Number 4 is how the pins work and how it operates with the lock. Number 5 is how to pick it. We'll take a nice close look at each pin individually and the concepts behind how they work. Progressive pinning is something that is up to you if you want to do, but I have a method that will help with being able to learn this lock more effectively if you choose to take that step into your progress. And then number 7, I'll do a demonstration to show all of these things put together. And in the last section, I will give some acknowledgements to people who have helped me make this guide. Thank you very much for tuning in, and let's get to it. Although ASSA has many high security locks, which technically the 700 is not one of, the ASSA 700 is considered to be one of the hardest locks that a picker will face in their lock picking journey. They're made in Sweden and they're extremely common there. In North America, our most common lock is the quickset lock, and if I put them side by side where I line the shoulders up, which is the part that interacts with the front of the lock right there, we can see how monstrous the ASSA 700 is in comparison. Also, you can see that this key is made out of brass, where this one's made out of steel. You can get these ones in steel as well, but you'd be very hard pressed to find an ASSA 700 key that's made in brass, which means they're a lot stronger and they would take a lot of force to break. Another difference between these locks is that standard North American locks will have basic standard driver pins, maybe sometimes a spool or a driver pin with a light serration or two, whereas the ASSA 700 is the epitome and the highest technology of basic pin tumbler locks and is extremely hard to attack, whether it's through picking or impressioning or bumping or any method used to try to open a lock besides using the key. I also have an American 1100 key here just for fun to show how much of a size difference this key is. So these keys these locks are pretty big, and they definitely are very difficult to pick. They have been around for the last almost half a century, and they are the most common locks that you'll find in Sweden. They were designed for residential use, so pretty much every single door that you find in Sweden will have one of these locks on it. There are all sorts of different formats. I have 2 oval cylinders here, and you can see they have different keyways and also different face plates or faces to the core. And I also have a padlock here, which is pretty neat, with a snowman core, and it's key retaining, which is pretty cool. There are different versions of the pins inside with barrel spools, but typically you will find inside these locks they have gin spools with matched counter milling and also Christmas tree pins and tapered pins, but I'll go over that in the next chapter. If you are familiar with the lock picking belt system, then you will perhaps know that these locks are ranked as a red belt lock, which is 1 belt below the black belt level. Why are such a standard basic pin tumbler lock ranked at such a high level? Typically at the red belt level, you'll see locks that have at least at least 2 different locking mechanisms. But with the ASSA 700, it is just such an advanced type of pin tumbler lock with very precise feedback required in order to pick it, that it qualifies to be at that level, and anybody who has picked one has agreed that it is quite the challenge and deserves its place as a red belt lock. Anyways, without any further ado, let's move on to the next section. Here I have a fully gutted ASSA 700 with the more advanced Christmas tree pins and gin spool driver pins as they currently come from the factory. And this version of the lock is what will be the focus of this guide. I will be going through all the different components of this lock in close detail for you in a moment. And this part right here is a shim, which is very essential in order to gut this thing in a safe way. I just made sure to put that there as a little side note. Starting out with the housing, you can see the ASSA with the classic SCD inscription on the front. You can see all of those 7 slots for pins down the top of the chamber there. Nothing else in here, because there's no secondary locking mechanism, so no need for a slot for a sidebar or anything like that. On the back we have our 2 holes for putting in the screws in order to mount it from the other side, and some stamped numbering at the top to indicate this specific unit was for a specific purpose at one point in time. And we can see at the very top are 7 pin chambers and 2 anti-drill pins in between the first and second chamber on the top on either side. Here's the plug with the 7 slots and the 2 anti-drill pin holes that house these 2 little anti-drill pins that will make drilling this plug much more difficult, with all of the other drill protection that exists in this lock as well. There is countermilling on slots 1, 2, 4, and 6, and that's matched on both sides. And there is nothing on 3, 5, and 7, which will be the slots that the tapered pins will rest in, where these other slots will be the slots that house either the Christmas tree pins or the gin spool pins. If we continue rotating a bit, you see this little hole right here and here, which I'm not 100% sure what that's for. So if you know, please feel free to educate me in the comments. And there is also this slot right here, which is for this C-clip. These C-clips are pretty beastly themselves, and they will only take a little bit of bending back and forth a couple times before they totally snap. So I'll leave a link in the description for a place you can buy more of them. But I will also show later in this video a method that you can use to temporarily put a clip on the back of your lock without using this one that you get with the lock. So you can save it for when you want to use it without bending it back and forth a bunch of times. Also, we have a slot right in here for the actuator to rest. And in the front of the keyway, we can see the shape that this keyway has, and that is the plug. Here are 2 tapered pins, and as you can see, they look pretty similar to standard pins, except they have a slight taper on the top and the bottom if you pay close attention. All that means is that there is a slightly larger diameter at this point and a slightly shorter diameter right at the edge at this point. And what that does for picking is when you set this pin, it will drop back down just a small amount, and you'll have to go through the pins multiple times in order to set all of the tapered pins. If you look closely at this second tapered pin, inside of it there is actually a steel core, which is for anti-drill protection. And if you look closely on the bottom edge, you can see that taper there, and same thing at the top right there. Here's a gin spool, and the upper section you can see looks like a standard pin, but then we have this spooled section right here and the lower lip underneath that. If you pay attention to that lower lip, you'll see it has a shorter diameter than the upper section of the spool. That's because if you set this pin above the shear line before you achieve the false set, then the spring pressure of the spring will push the pin back down into that countermilling. This lower lip will fall into that countermilling because this bottom part is a small enough diameter to fit into the remaining hole that's left. It will get stuck right at that part right there on the shear line. Let me give you a little bit of a closer look so you can see this pin with a bit more detail. Here's a Christmas tree pin, and just like with the gin spool pin, you can see that there's this standard section at the top, but then we have this extra spooled section that's added with another lip before we get to this lower lip right here. The secondary lip that was added has the same diameter as the top part, but again, the lower lip has a shorter diameter so that it will drop back down into the milling if this pin is picked before you achieve the false set. If you do get stuck on this section right here, then it is actually pretty easy to just lift the pin up in most situations and you will get counter rotation, whereas once you pass that point and get to this section right here, you will no longer get counter rotation and you'll have to float pick the pin just like with all of the other gin spools. Let me grab this guy here to give you a closer look. These are the kind of key pins you can expect to find in the ASSA 700. First of all, we have standard key pins, but we also have these guys right here, which are called torpedo key pins with this kind of spooled mushroom section above. That's because if you overset this pin, then you will get stuck in that section and it will be very difficult to get that pin from out of that overstate situation unless you drop all your other pins. Let me give a closer look of that torpedo pin for you guys. Last but not least, we have the spring here, and as you can see, there is a middle section which is, I heard two really good answers for. First of all, to provide stability to this longer style spring, but also to prevent the springs from catching all together like this. And I have a bunch of standard steel springs to show you what they typically look like if I can manage to disengage one. Alright, so you can see it's quite a difference in size between these ASSA 700 springs and just a standard steel spring. And here it is all put back together. You can see on the back how that actuator sits in that slot in the plug and how the C-clip holds it all together. Here is the key, and as you can see, the lock operates very smoothly as these locks are intended. Here's the model to help represent what we just went over with a tapered gin spool and Christmas tree security driver pin, and also a standard and torpedo key pin. The plug has countermilling outlined in green on both sides that matches the bottom of the gin spool and the Christmas tree pin. But first, let's take a look at the tapered pin and see how that works. And in order to do that, let's see how picking a standard pin works. When we pick the standard pin, as we apply tension and it reaches the shear line, we'll get a little click and a minute movement of the core as we set that pin. That small movement will be enough to prevent the pin from dropping back down. But with a tapered pin, because the bottom of it is a smaller diameter than the middle section, it will actually be able to drop down slightly, just to around wherever the taper matches the distance that the plug can turn, and that will be enough to prevent the plug from being able to rotate. Now let's look at the gin spool, but before we do that, let's see how picking a normal spool works. When we're hung up on a normal spool and we apply tension to the plug, we'll fall into what's called a false set, and as we apply tension or pressure with our pick to the pin, the bottom of the pin that's underneath it, we'll get counter rotation as we set the bottom of the lip of that spool past the shear line, which will allow us to rotate the plug once it goes all the way past. With a gin spool, what will happen is we'll apply tension to the plug and we'll lift the pin to the counter milling, and it will catch into that point right there. And because of the nature of gin spools, we won't get counter rotation as we push up on this pin, unlike a normal spool. Also, because of the smaller diameter of the bottom, similar to with the tapered pin, if we set this pin prematurely before we achieve a deep enough false set, this pin will be able to drop back down into the counter milling. Let's take a look at the Christmas tree pin, which is very similar to the gin spool, but we have this upper spooled section as well. And with this spooled section, it's common to be able to get counter rotation as you put pressure. Whereas once you fall into this section, you will not get that counter rotation anymore. Also similar to with the gin spool, it has the smaller diameter at the bottom lip of this pin, so if you set this pin prematurely, before you get a deep enough false set, it too will be able to drop back down into the milling. Now let's look at the torpedo key pin, but before we do that, let's actually see how setting a normal key pin works. If we overset this pin, we'll be hung up, and there isn't much movement of the plug. If we're gentle as we release tension, we can often catch that point where the pin drops. But with a torpedo key pin, if we overset it, we'll fall into a false set. And that false set will, first of all, confuse us between this false set. But if you practice the difference between them, you'll be able to differentiate the two. But also, if we try to release tension to let that pin drop, it will usually result in everything either dropping into the milling or dropping all the way back down. Also, when we're picking these pins, because of this top lip here and the counter milling, and we're applying tension, it's common to get extra clicks as you try to set past the shear line here. And it's easier to see that actually with a tapered pin, which I'll use here to demonstrate. As we get up to the milling, we'll get little clicks at these points that we'll have to fight past in order to get the tapered pin set. It really depends on how your lock is bitted, with either the torpedo pin matched with the tapered pin, or the standard pin matched with the tapered pin, or same thing with the gin spools and the Christmas tree pins, what they're matched with. Obviously these are the trickier ones, but it's not common to find only torpedo pin key pins in the 700s. Usually it's a mix between the two. The concept of picking tapered pins is pretty simple in theory, but in reality can be pretty challenging and frustrating. First we have to set the pin, but because there will be other pins hanging up the plug from rotating further, the tapered pin will be able to drop back down. So we will have to repeat the process multiple times until the plug can make slight turns every single time until it's able to fall into the false set or rotate all the way. Now, the reason why it can be challenging is because once you have set the pin and you drop back down, especially with really high cut pins, you won't feel anything in this distance of travel, which will be very similar to how a set pin feels. It will feel loose and not springy at all, just falling down by the weight of gravity. So you'll have to test each pin one by one very carefully to be able to identify if that pin is set or not. Furthermore, as you can see, even just a little bit of the tapered pin being caught up in the shear line is enough to stop it from turning. So you'll have to be constantly tapping that pin in order to set it. And there are multiple tapered pins in the ASSA 700, so you'll have to repeat that process multiple times with each pin. The key to picking it is heavy tension and pick precision and relentless testing. And once you are comfortable with that, you'll be able to set that tapered pin. Now let's look at picking a gin spool. The first section of the pin is like a standard pin. So if you are hung up on the tapered pins, this section of the pin will stop those tapered pins from being able to set all the way. So you'll have to make sure to set past that point at least. If there are still tapered pins in the way, you might be caught up at that point right there, but it will be caught up in the milling, which is the first stage of picking the gin spool. Once all the tapered pins are set and you are in the full false set of the plug, then now it's time to focus on how to get out of this milling and getting this bottom lip of the pin out. And for this, you will need to apply a concept called float picking. If you haven't seen my previous video, I'll leave a link in the description for that on a more in-depth review on what float picking is. But in order to quickly just review it here, we need to either use 2 tensioners or 1 really tight-fitting tensioner to balance the tension very, very precisely in order to get the very perfect spot in order to allow this bottom lip to pass this section without dropping your other gin spools. The problem with that though isn't just about balance, it's about feeling and precision of knowing what to do. So as you're in this point, you want to go as far as you can into the false set, and then slowly just back off just a hair. If that's what you did, good, test the pin. Now it should feel slightly looser than it did before. When you're all the way in a deep false set, if you test the pin, it should feel pretty stiff. Once you loosen up slightly, there will be a little bit of jiggle to the pin. If you loosen up a little bit more, you'll feel a little bit more jiggle. Now, you don't want to just continue loosening up and testing bit by bit. Some people have a method where they just bounce the pin like this rapidly to test it, or some people have a method where they do it just slowly. Just feeling, and the concept of it is that you don't want to be holding the pin at the top of the counter milling and then trying to pop it out as you get past it, because when you do that, it will rotate the plug back further than you intend, which will drop the other pins. So you need to balance the tension just slightly, test the key pin, let it drop down after each test. Once it drops down, let it test again. I prefer the slow method myself. Then as you back up slightly, don't just test, also test on different angles of the key pin. Test on this side, test on this side, almost like you're picking a Medico lock. And then slowly, as you are testing the pins and being very precise with your tension, you'll manage to scoot that pin past that milling. Sometimes you'll feel it rubbing, or sometimes you'll feel it super loose, able to just slide right past like that. Either way, once you feel that you've made some progress and that there's movement on this pin instead of just this jiggliness, but now you feel like the pin has actually risen up slightly, keep your cool. Try to get to the point where you can get back into the false set by continuing to push on it, and then the plug will be able to rotate again to this point. Now you know that this pin is set. Pay attention to the sound of if you are testing another gin spool and you hear this. If you hear the click of a pin dropping down, that usually means that you dropped one of your gin spools. And it's always good to just go back and test each one. Try to remember how high you lift up the pin and also relation to the pins around it so that you can get a good sense of if it's set or not. Because if you can feel it's up here, you know that you set it. You remember that's just a quick way to tell. But also you can test by putting a lot of tension and feeling if it's stiff, and then loosening up a bit if it feels like it's giving you a bit of jiggliness. Now let's look at how picking a Christmas tree pin works. As I mentioned earlier, when you're in the middle section of this pin and you lift the key pin below it, it will often give counter rotation as you lift the middle lip past the shear line. Once that lower lip is caught up in the counter milling, however, it won't give that same counter rotation, and you'll have to float it similar to a gin spool. That's what I recommend as the second stage of picking this lock. First, try to achieve the false set by picking all of the tapered pins, and once that's the case, you will be in this point. Check slots 1, 2, 4, and 6 by pushing up on it without even float picking. See if you can get counter rotation, and if so, then you have found a Christmas tree pin. and then you will be at this section of all of the pins. Once you have achieved this point where all of the Christmas tree pins are caught with the lower lip in the milling and all of the gin spools are there, then you're ready for the stage 3, which is picking the gin spools and balancing the tension, as I mentioned earlier, by floating very precisely and trying to get each gin spool up past the shear line. Let's do a quick review on the torpedo key pin. It's less of a demonstration on how to pick it and more on how not to pick it. But as I mentioned earlier, when you're in this false set, it's similar to when you're in this false set. But I find that this false set will be a little bit shallower than this false set. And furthermore, when you are in this state here, and you may think that you are in the false set that this lock provides because all of the tapered pins will have been picked by this point, you will be able to check the other gin spools. But once you try to float the other gin spools past the shear line, it will often result in the tapered pins dropping back down and losing the false set altogether. So in order to pick these pins, you just have to be gentle with your pick pressure and placement and making sure not to overset any pins, just trying to be very gentle on the feedback as you lift past them. And if you do fall into a false set, pay attention to the depth of it and see if it feels like it's right or if it feels like it's not deep enough. If it feels like it's not deep enough, go for it. Check some other gin spools. May as well not give up on it just yet. But if when you're picking the other gin spools, you end up dropping some of the tapered pins, then that likely means that you were hung up on a torpedo key pin. Here's my tried and tested method on how to progressive pin your lock in a way that will help you learn it within a very short amount of time. This is the same method that I've shown to other pickers that I've taught this lock to, and it's worked really well for them. The first stage is to focus on the tapered pins and to learn how to set a tapered pin with one gin spool or Christmas tree pin in the lock as well. If you don't have any gin spools, it's totally fine if you put the Christmas tree pin in. But the idea is to learn how to set the tapered pin and then float the tension without dropping that tapered pin once you achieve the false set. Once you're comfortable with one tapered pin, add in another one. I recommend working from the back to the front because it will be harder to reach the ones in the back first. So it will get those guys out of the way and you used to the hard stuff first and then the easier stuff after. So I would say tapered pin in 7 and then gin spool or Christmas tree pin in slot 6. Get used to that, add in slot 5, and then add in slot 3. Once you're comfortable with all of those pins, you'll notice that every tapered pin you add in, it will get a little bit more challenging, but if you learned it in that order, it should be within a short time that you're comfortable with all 4 of those pins. Now I recommend focusing on only gin spools and Christmas tree pins. So take the tapered pins out, leave that one gin spool in slot 6, and then add in a gin spool or Christmas tree pin in slot 4. Learn how to balance the tension between them as you try to float one in the false set without dropping the other. Once you're comfortable with 6 and 4, add in slot 2. And this is where my method of progressive pinning is a little bit different. I will actually take it all from the front at this point and focus on slots 1 and 2 instead of just adding in slot 1 right off the bat. Sometimes with gin spools especially, it can be pretty challenging to add in another pin from 3 pins to 4 can be a pretty big jump. So I like to start from pin 1 and then go to pin 2, add those two in right off the bat, and then learn how to balance it from that point. So it's like starting the process over again. Then you add in slot 4, so you have 1, 2, and 4. Get comfortable with those 3, and then finally add in slot 6, and you're ready for pretty much everything at that point once you're comfortable picking all 4 of the gin spools. The first stage of the lock is to fall into that false set, and then the next stage is to do what you just did by picking all 4 of the Christmas tree or gin spools without dropping any of them. If you can do these 2 stages, then you're ready for the third stage, which is just to put everything in there. Okay, wait. Before you actually start progressive pinning, it's time to go over some important, crucial gutting tips so that you can avoid bricking your lock. And the first tip is to go over the back here. If you can see, we have this super thick clip with this actuator that blocks us access to it, besides the small little section where it opens up in the bottom. What I recommend to do in order to get the clip off at first is to wedge a tensioner in that little space there and twist your tensioner in a way that you can get it in between the two parts and open it up. Once your tensioner can go in between like that, and you've wedged it in like that, now turn it to the 90-degree point, and this actuator should be able to come off. If you don't have these kind of clips to help you spread it further, you can continue doing the method and prying it, but you risk bending it sideways. And if you twist this clip, it will be a lot harder to put it back on safely. So I recommend using something like this. Once you're at this point, you can rotate the clip back 90 degrees, so that way it is not going to be in the way. And we want to load our circlip removers in between them, and we can extend them, which will spread the C-clip apart far enough for you to be able to get it out, hopefully. Just like that. The next thing I wanted to go over is, instead of using this one over and over again to progressive pin your lock, this will end up breaking. I'll leave a link in the description for where you can get more of these things, as I mentioned earlier. But what you can use in the meantime is a paper clip. So let me show how I would do that. First of all, I bend it straight. You can also use metal wire if you have that accessible to you, but this is just what I had. And then I make a little curve there. I'll bring it close to the lock, but before I do that, I like to add in a little lip at the top. So I'll squeeze the top a little bit like this, just to bring it together a little bit more. Okay, now I'll close these two ends by twisting them nice and tight. Doesn't need to be perfect for now, but now I'll take this end that I started off with and I'll close it even more tightly. And then with this here, the lock will not be able to come off. If I want to take it out at any point, I can just put something in here, twist it open, spread it apart, whether I do it with these pliers or circlip removers, however I want to do it. But it's super easy to take the paper clip off, and you don't need to worry about risking to break it because you can just get another paper clip, worst comes to worst. But this will be good enough to prevent you from slipping the plug out. The next stage, or the next thing I want to go over, is using a shim to gut. So here's the key. Let's rotate the plug. And when you're gutting this, I find you don't want to rotate it all the way 90 degrees because there's a slot right here that the pins can fall down. But you also don't want to rotate it like 45 degrees because there's other pins. Oh, I got the wrong key here. Or, yeah, this is the wrong key. Rotate the plug to about just where you can see that slot. If it was 90 degrees, it would be like that. You just move it just slightly off of there. Then it won't be in line with the anti-drill pin holes that are in the plug, and it also won't be in line with these slots here. Next, of course, we don't want to just take it out at this point anyways, because we have to be extra safe. We want to use a shim. So we'll get that shim inside. And then the last stage is to use a follower that is about 14 millimeters. That's the size that you want in diameter for the follower. So if you're going to 3D print one, or if you have access to something that has a diameter of 14 millimeters, that's what you want for this. I also like to grip onto the shim so that way I can make sure, in case it's not on that last pin, it'll push it through as I kind of get this lock into place. And then I will keep sliding the plug. And here are these little holes that we have to be super careful of. Oh, dropped a little master wafer from slot 2, but I caught it. So be very careful with those little master wafers if your lock has them. And here is those little anti-drill pin holes. You have to be super careful because, let me grab a gin spool out from here, or a Christmas tree pin, whatever comes out of the front. Christmas tree pin. These guys can fall into these slots, and if that happens, then you're kind of hooped because there's no way to access those slots from the inside of the plug. But if that does happen to you, there is a way to unbrick it. So if you ever are stuck in that position, don't be shy to message me or to reach out to anybody in the LPU Discord, and we will be able to give you some advice on how to unbrick your lock. Anyways, those are my essential tips on gutting it. Make sure to be super careful when gutting this lock and have lots of fun. Don't be too intimidated. It's not too difficult, but it does have its risks. Alright, let's put everything that we learned together and pick the lock. I have an ASSA 700 here in front of me, and I'll be using this steak knife that I turned into a deeper profile gem hook in order to pick it. And I also marked up the other end so that way it's easier for you guys to see which pin I'm on precisely. And it also is just a good learning tool for anybody who wants a little help learning where they are in the lock. Okay, first stage of picking this lock is to find all of the tapered pins and try to get to the false set. So we know our tapered pins are in slots 3, 5, and 7, so we're going to mainly focus on that as we tickle our way to the back and try to make sure there's no gin spools that are slightly caught on the standard section of their pin. I feel number 5 is binding, so we know that's a tapered pin, so I'll take advantage of the opportunity and pick it. Now 6 is okay, 7 is binding, that's our other tapered pin. From here on out, I'll mainly focus on the tapered pins unless I feel like they're all set and something is off. Okay, so tapered pin is set on 7. Now 5 is already set. Okay, 3. 3 feels like it's binding. And I set it, but I heard some other pins kind of fall down on the process. Okay, 7. 7 gave a little click. 5 feels okay. 3 feels like I gave a little touch to the end and it just set past that tapered point of the pin. Now we're in the false set, so the next stage of picking the lock is to find all of the Christmas tree pins. So we know we want to search slots 1, 2, 4, and 6 for those pins. So let's start with that. Pin 1 is giving counter rotation, and we set it. Pin 2 is also giving counter rotation, and we set it. 1 still feels good. Now we're going to check pin 4. 4 is not giving counter rotation. I'll check pin 6. Pin 6 is also not giving counter rotation. So now we're going to go to stage 3 of picking the lock, which is balancing the tension between all of the gin spools. So I have my second tensioner in place in a way that will allow me to balance the tension and also fit my pick in. Okay, now I'm going to go through all of the pins one by one, all of the gin spools, starting from the back, because I find it's the hardest one to go for, so I may as well try to get it out of the way first. And since it's so far back there, I find the closer ones are easier. So anyways, what I'm trying to focus on here is I'm going to back off the tension just a hair, and now I'm going to pump the pin basically, just lightly. Every single time I give a push to it, I release it fully. And now I'm going to go a little bit to the left side. Now to the right side. Now to the left side of the pin, just like I'm picking a medical lock almost, except I'm not trying to pull the pin, I'm just trying to push on different angles of the pin. And also in the center too. Okay, I'm going to back off a little bit more, just a hair. And I may hear some stuff drop on the way, but I'm just going to try to focus on 6 for now. Okay, oh, I heard something drop. But I'm going to, okay, I felt 6 go up there. So 6 finally did go up there. So we'll try to see what dropped on the way back. So now we are going to check pin 4. Same thing, just back off a hair. And then check the left side. Okay, it actually went up right away. Okay, now we're going to check pin 2. Back off a hair. Check the right side. Check the left side. I heard something drop, but I also felt the number 2 just drop into place. Okay, and I just want to check from the back. 6 still feels good. 4 feels like 4 fell. So I'm gonna go for 4 one more time. Go to the left side. Seemed to like the left side last time, but this time no. Right side. Center. Okay, now it went up straight from the center. Alright, so now we'll check pin 1. Check the left side. Oh, and it went into place. Now, 2 felt like it gave a lot of counter rotation, so I suspect that was the spooled part of the Christmas tree that dropped earlier when I was setting the gin spool number 6. So I think number 2 is still yet to be fully set, so I'm going to check a little bit on the right side. Oh, and it went, and there we go. The lock is opened. So as you can see, it takes like being able to really precisely feel the feedback and paying attention to where you are, remembering where you are, remembering what you heard before, paying attention to the little sounds that you hear along the way. But if you want to see a video where I pick and gut this lock fully, I just don't want this video to be too long, I will leave a link to that in the description below. I want to make sure to give a huge thank you to Amvgaert and Yohapii for helping me to source my 700s. If it wasn't for guys like this in the community, then I wouldn't even have my locks to work on, let alone to make guides on. So thank you so much for helping me to find those locks. Also, I want to thank Roon Picker and Mr.Sticky Pick. You guys really helped me to put this video together and to bounce ideas off of. I really appreciate your generosity with your time and helping me to feel confident that the information I was putting forward here was good. CornCob and Lord Daniel Aidan Smith both helped me to come out with that 3D printed model that you guys saw earlier. That thing is freaking awesome, and I'll definitely be using it in more videos. Thank you guys so much for helping me with that. CornCob helped design it, and Daniel helped print it and send it over. That was super generous of you guys, just like everybody here with all of their kindness. I also want to thank Snow for helping me to learn how to pick my 700 in the first place. He is an extremely good picker and also a great teacher. If you ever have the pleasure of running into him, make sure to ask him a lot of questions. Also, thank you guys for checking out this video and your continued support. It really motivates me to continue with this content, and I really appreciate everything that you guys give to me when I put this stuff out for you. Anyways, hope you're doing well. Take care. Make sure to check the description for some helpful resources, and all the best.